there are some recipes that I have, especially for meatballs. I make really, really good meatballs. And there are some recipes that I have that you don't want to mess with. Sometimes in the course of things, you think you could improve them by adding this or adding that or looking at it or doing it a different way. But the truth of the matter is you just don't want to mess with it. And really, that is the gospel today. You really just don't want to mess with this one. There is something about what Jesus is trying to explain in a very simple fashion by bringing about a parable of this magnitude with all these different moving pieces that he's really trying to simply teach and try to get us to possibly grasp the incredible compassion and love the Father has for us. And so he lays out this parable. Now, remember the crowd. There are here in this place, God bless you, there are here in this place tax collectors and prostitutes sitting around a table eating with Jesus, which would have been totally unheard of for any religious leader of the time, to be sitting and eating with them, giving them the time of day, sharing their company. They, however, have sort of showed up. They're not eating, but they're at a distance, and they are terribly concerned that Jesus, by giving them any time of day, is honoring them and raising their status. And so they have all this to say. Jesus does not respond to them except for in the form of this parable. We know the story. The younger brother pretty much goes to his father and says, "You're dead to me. Give me my share of the inheritance." You're dead to me. What do I mean by that? You don't split up an estate or an inheritance unless someone's died. The father's alive. And you could just imagine the anguish in the father's heart and the time that passed between hearing his son declare that you're dead to me, give me what's due me so I could be on my way, and when he actually began dividing up the estate. Dividing an estate would not have been easy. It would have taken time. Items would have had to be sold off. Property would have been sold. Animals would have had to be sold off. And a division would have had to be made so that the older son, who's still there, is due what that older son is due. But we definitely need to figure out and determine what is due the younger son. So there is a process here. According to the story, it makes it look as though this happens immediately. But I want us to be focused on the anguish that the father has, having to actually go through the process while he is alive, of trying to figure out what is due to the two sons and responding to this request, which, by the way, he had no legal right or need to respond to. The younger son doesn't have any claim on this at all. Most of the time it goes to the older son. But notice even here in this part of this parable that the father is being so compassionate to even understand that the younger son, though he is younger, is still entitled. On top of that, recognize that the father is willing to address the needs of the younger son because the younger son must believe that he would be better off somewhere else, and that if he had the things that were due him now, his life would be happier. But recognize that the statement to the father is, "You're dead to me. Give me what's mine." We know that the son goes off. We know that he spends all of his money, and he ends up, when the famine hits the land, he ends up with no money, no resources, and ends up now religiously working for the one animal and providing for the one animal that, according to the Jewish traditions, they're not supposed to be providing for or touching or caring for or even owning. And so now religiously, Not only do we have this amazing sacrilege against the Father that you're dead to me, but now religiously, he is basically as impure as you could possibly become by providing and caring for the swine. And he's starving. Not only is he stuck caring for them, living by them, smelling all that, being around the mud and everything else, but as much as he would love to simply eat the leftovers that are thrown to the pigs, no one is giving him anything, and he's still starving. And so there he is in the midst of all this, and he's dying. He is totally desolate. He has nothing. He has no place to go, and no one cares about him. And his motivation for returning home isn't, wow, I really messed up. I really made a mistake. I really did this all wrong. No. Jesus puts the motivation in the young boy's mouth. My dad, wow, he had all these servants who used to work for him. And every single one of them ate and went to bed full. What am I doing here? Let me just go home and I'll say to my father, look, I'm not worthy to be called your son, so forget about that. But would you possibly hire me as a servant just because at least then I know I'd be fed? So he heads off and is on his way and recognize the language that is used here by Luke about the fact that he is still a ways off. Now, Mediterranean cultures, the father of a house does not run. He doesn't run. He doesn't exert himself. He's the father of the house. He, with his robes, commands what happens. He is tended to by wives and children. He is tended to because culturally, that's his position. The very fact that he sees his son at a distance, and the gospel makes it clear that this guy runs at him. Now, as he's running, recognize that the rest of the servants must be trying to figure out what's going on, and they're chasing after him, trying to figure out where he's going. So they're all chasing, trying to figure out what's so important that he would run, because it's so out of the ordinary. And so when he gets there, the son starts this whole sermon that he has been working on and probably talking about all the way through. He's probably said it 10,000 times in his head. He probably figured out exactly how he was going to use his tone, how he was going to use his head, how he was going to bow down, how he was going to be, needy and sort of hoping and how he would position himself. And the father has very little time, if anything, to hear any of that because he doesn't care. Doesn't care what comes out of his mouth. Doesn't care at all what the motivation is. His motivation's not good. He's not upset. He's not sad. He's not asking for forgiveness. He's not looking for mercy or compassion. He just wants to eat. I mean, we're talking about core, basic, human need. Has nothing to do with respecting the Father. Has nothing to do with wanting the Father's love. And yet the Father doesn't care about what the motivation is. What he cares about is that his son is there. And as the son is babbling, you could already hear the father speaking over it and commanding now the servants who have just bolted how many fields to get there. They're probably all out of the breath, right? And he's saying, go back, get a robe, put a ring on the finger. Why? Because a ring is exactly this is how you would buy anything in the marketplace. The ring is the insignia of the family. The ring is the insignia of the family. It says who you belong to. It says whose son you are. And thereby, showing the ring would give this boy anything he wants anywhere because of the insignia of the father's crest upon his hands and the robe and sandals. So this slumbering blob of a person who comes, who probably reeks from pigs and filth, and he is now talk about putting a brand new robe over him and putting sandals on his filthy feet and putting a ring on him. He reestablishes him right at the moment. He doesn't wait till he gets back to the house to do any of this. He does it, recognize this. Jesus has him doing it right there on the spot. There's no discussion. There's no negotiation. It doesn't matter to the Father. It doesn't matter what he smells like. Doesn't matter what he looks like. For him, it's simply his Son has returned, and he is instantaneously restored at that moment in time. Instantaneously. And he turns to the servants, who probably at this point are totally exhausted from running back and forth to the house to get all this stuff. Get the fatted calf. Now, typically for people of wealth, there are a few animals that they hold and they get real fat, and they hold them specifically for big celebrations. Most of the time, holy days. Days that are identified as the most important, the most precious of celebrations. The highlight of a year, if you will. And so he says, kill the fatted calf and let us have a feast. The son goes in, hopefully has a bath before dinner, and there is a celebration that takes place. And the father has, with a celebration, invited everybody. Invited everyone, all the neighbors, everyone coming in, and you could imagine the neighbors. Why is he having this party? You mean the son who took everything, and now we're going back and he's having a party? Is the man off his rocker? Like, what's he doing? You know, that son, he should be locked up somewhere, until he pays back every single cent that he took. What is he doing? It doesn't mean that any of those people are going to pass up a good party, okay? None of them are passing up a good party. They're all going to show up. We're talking a fatted calf. We're talking about free-flowing wine, We're talking about dancing. We're talking about music. Yeah, okay, I'll go. But you can imagine the murmuring in the crowd as they see the boy come out now, and with now the insignia ring of the father back on his hand, and the father walking around joyfully celebrating this, and they're all stuck in their cultural world of going, no. This isn't right. He's not entitled to any of that stuff. What's wrong with him? But it's not just the crowd. The older son comes back, and the older son, still at a distance, calls one of the servants and goes, I'm away a couple hours in the field. What happened? Why is all this taking place? And the servant, probably kind of scared by the tone of the older, says, your younger brother is home and your father is throwing a party. And notice that despite the maturity that should be part of the older son, he refuses to go into the party. I'm not going. He can invite me all he wants. I'm not showing up. I'm not going. He's outside. The father equally goes out to talk to the older son. The father at this point has no limitations to how far he will go to try to get everyone to understand what it is that he's trying to accomplish, and that love is the most primary important thing, and that should be employed here. So he loses all respect for culturally. He loses respect with his younger son. His servants are probably trying to figure out what was wrong with him and why is he doing this. All of his neighbors at the party are saying, you're not acting like a reasonable, rational person. What are you doing? You deserve this. He did that. You should be doing this. You shouldn't be doing that. And even his older son, won't come in. And yet the father goes out and humbles himself yet again to try to explain his position. The one thing I never understood until last night working on this sermon, and I was saying this to Donna. I didn't tell her the whole story because, she'll give it away. The older son comes and he says, I have slaved for you all of these years, and you never even gave me a goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. The older son wasn't doing what he was doing out of love. He felt as though he was in servitude. All these years I slaved for you. Those aren't exactly the words of someone who wakes up and goes out about doing what they're doing because he feels part of this or connected, which makes sense why the Father says, please understand, everything I have is yours. Well, now, half of everything I had because gave your younger brother. But we'll get back to that later. However, right now, everything I have is yours. And yet, all during the time of the older son's service, he never really understood that he was the Father's son. And so what is intriguing is that the statement that the younger son says about, you're dead to me, is also embodied in the older son, who isn't doing it because he's the son. He's doing it out of servitude. And he's only serving because when he dies, he's going to get what he gets. When the master dies, the rest comes to him. Both of the sons have a problem. Both of the sons, neither one, fully respect or love the Father. The Father is not embraced or responded to. One thinks that he has to be a servant, and by doing these good things, and by acting, and by working hard, and by all this, I get my Father's appreciation, his privilege. I get to be who I am. I get to be his son because I'm doing these things. And then the other son on the other side is like, you're dead to me. Give me what I want and run off. But the two aren't too far separated from a very similar motivation between the two. Go back to the beginning of the parable. Who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to tax collectors and prostitutes, and he's also talking to religious leaders. And he's calling out and he's saying, yes, you may have dismissed and have thrown away and wanted what you wanted and threw away your inheritance, but the Father's going to treat you this way. And he's also saying to the Pharisees and the scribes who are outside, you're no better. You do what you do. You act the way you act. You act religiously and perform religiously because you think that's what gets you into the Father's graces. You're no better than a slave. Both of you have it all messed up. Both of you have made the mistake. You're no greater or better than the prostitutes and the tax collectors I'm eating dinner with. You think you somehow can deserve and earn these things when the reality is you can't. You can't. And the interesting thing is both have been around the Father an awfully long time. The scribes and the Pharisees are immersed in the scriptures. And they still don't get the message. They still don't understand the love, the unconditional love that God has. After all of that, they still don't understand. After everything they've learned, they still don't understand that. And they still choose to think in some way, shape, or form they are separated from everyone else only by their works. And because they are so self-absorbed in what they're doing and acting in order to perform in such a way that God appreciates them, they totally miss anyone else who is in need of love or compassion because they are so self-absorbed in their own religious world, their own religious inspection, which has nothing to do, their own religious perspective, which has nothing to do with anyone else or anything that God is about. They've created this world for themselves. The tax collectors and the prostitutes, which, by the way, folks, if you're on and you're watching, there's really no one sitting over here. This is why I'm pointing here. If there were people sitting here, I wouldn't be calling them tax collectors or prostitutes. I'm just filling in, okay, just so you know. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes, they have accepted the invitation. They're sitting with Jesus. What we don't know is what happens with the scribes and the Pharisees. At the end of the parable, at the end of the scene, at the end of the situation, we know that the tax collectors and the sinners that socially have been identified as sinners, those are sitting with Jesus, listening to the good news. We don't know what happens with the others. One last point that I want us to bring up, because I think it's something that I think this week we should work on. This parable is filled with celebration. It's filled with joy. It's filled with an exuberance that comes because of who God is and personified in the parable. You know, everyone comes and they celebrate. They might be muttering behind his back, but they're celebrating because of how the Father has acted and what the Father is. And yet during this season of Lent, we are always about negativity. It's about sinfulness. It's all that. But I'm wondering if there shouldn't be Lenten joy. If there shouldn't be a Lenten celebration. If the real reason for Lent is for us to redirect and better understand who and what we are, then we are either the tax collectors and the sinners, and our acceptance is guaranteed, but also we have the Father for those of us who have been doing the religious thing and we feel as though we're connected or whatever, but maybe we need to grow in certain areas. The invitation's there for us as well. I am enamored by the fact that God the Father, personified in this dad, in this parable, goes and he meets the son, and he also talks to the older son as well. He communicates to both. He's not isolating either one. He's letting them know what the truth is, and he is inviting both of them to the celebration of his love. And I honestly don't think we are open enough or brave enough or courageous enough to actually go the distance to understand what Jesus is really telling us about the characteristic and the heart of the Father. We get very nervous thinking about a God who loves us no matter what. We get very nervous about that. We get very put off because then everyone goes, well, everyone can. No, love doesn't do that. Any of us who have had and been in a love relationship, we know that love is transformative. Love, as much as fear, can transform. And I think, for most part, we have been very comfortable with the fear perspective of saying, if you don't do this, you're going to hell. Well, we have a problem, because the problem is that Jesus spoke this parable. This is his parable. He's telling the story. It's not Paul. It's not one of the apostles. This is coming out of Jesus, who we declare is the Son of the ever-living God, Lord and Messiah, Savior, Redeemer. This is coming out of his words about his experience, how in human terms he can possibly communicate what the Father is really like. And yet, if you stand in the midst of that, if you simply allow yourself to bask in just this parable, it shatters everything else that we've ever been taught. Because we have always used God's love as a sort of a taunt. It's sort of like the carrot in front of the donkey, so that the donkey would keep moving forward. And yet that's not the case here. It's never been the case. The invitation for us as Christians is not to deserve God's love, it's to accept God's love. Acceptance. To live in the reality that we are sons and daughters. That the ring by baptism has already been given to us. And that what we do, we don't do out of servitude. We don't do it because we're forced to or for the fear of hell. All of that's taken care of. I mean, I'm sorry, but these aren't my words. These are the Master's words. He has left that for generation after generation after generation. We talk about this, but no one ever talks about the fact that there is this other side. And the other side is that there's a lot of us who feel we're already entitled because of all the religious activity we do and how we are as a Christian people. I go to church on Sunday. I read the Bible, and yet none of that seemed to really matter. Because if it's not getting you to see the needs of others or show compassion to others, and if we really understand the Father's love, if we can really experience the Father's love. See, this is one last point, and then I sit down, I promise. But I don't believe that God is hiding his intentions or his love or his emotions. I don't believe God is trying to make this difficult in any way, shape, or form. We're the ones who make it difficult. God has already manifested himself by sending forth his Son to walk and to be one of us. Why is it that we think that in a moment of prayer that God's not going to be there? That somehow we have to get God's attention, that we have to cry out and we have to do all this 49 novenas or 49 days of novena, whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like, really? Honestly? Because that's not found in the scriptures. It's not found of how God actually is. It seems to me the moment that we would turn our attention to wanting to go to God to address a need or a concern or anxiety or fear or something, that even as we're turning, he's already running to us to hear what it is that we are, to what it is that we need. And yet we make this so hard that we have to jump through so many hoops in order to end up in God's good graces. And yet the parables, Jesus' stories about how God is, do not embody that. And we simply cannot deny that we have messed up some of this interpretation because we're trying to control what God is and can and does do. And I think Jesus has made it perfectly clear that's not how the Father is. So do we not have joy because we are not thinking correctly about how God is? Do we not have joy because we're not knowledgeable enough about God's love for us? Because if we even understood for an instant that God loved us, then we would seek for that experience. But man, we are so bad at putting ourselves down. We are so bad thinking we're not deserving. We're so bad that we have to get this right. The younger son was just hungry. He was just hungry. Maybe just being hungry is enough. And then allow God to do the rest. There's one good thing that the son did. He at least turned in the direction and started walking home. And maybe that's all that's required of us. And then the older son at least held a conversation with the father. And though in his honesty, I'm sure the father was as hurt as he was hearing that he was dead to the younger son, knowing that the older son thought he was a servant. But the message would be the same for us. Everything I have is already yours. Why, as a Christian church, don't we celebrate who we already are in God's eyes, in God's house? God bless you.